ears does Daniel Boone have? 3. He's got a left ear, a right ear, and a frontier. That one's good. All right. Um, we are almost at the end of chapter 7. We need to wrap up slavery and then finish up by talking about section 4, which is about westward expansion. And there's 2 categories in westward expansion. Number 1 is infrastructure, and number 2 is the slavery issue. All right. But the very first thing we need to do is finish the end of section 3, which talks about slavery and Nat Turner's rebellion. All right. So in the last class, we talked about what abuses slaves suffered, what their daily life was like, and obviously it was very, very bad. Right. So the abuses of slavery didn't go completely unnoticed by the federal government. Like I said, there were a lot of abolitionists, mostly from northern states, who are now members of Congress. The southern states are worried that Congress or the president or the courts, someone at the level of federal government, is going to outlaw slavery. And they had pretty good reason for thinking that this was going to happen. Number one, a lot of abolitionists in Congress were very open about their intentions. They said, one of my priorities is getting rid of slavery in the United States. Another reason they had a good basis for believing that the federal government might do something to end slavery is because in the year 1808, Congress actually passed a law that made it illegal to import slaves into the United States. So this ended the transatlantic slave trade as it pertained to the United States. So slave traders could not get slaves from outside of the United States. They couldn't get them from Africa. They couldn't get them from South America. They couldn't get them from the Caribbean. They couldn't get them from Latin America. All slaves in the United States had to be born to slave parents in the United States. Right? Now, one consequence of Congress banning importation of slaves in 1808 is it meant that African Americans in the United States, after a few generations, now had absolutely no contact with their ancestral homelands in Africa. Right? But even though they didn't really have much contact with Africa, a lot of African traditions were passed down for several generations. So African American generations did preserve aspects of African culture. They Americanized a lot of aspects of African culture. What do I mean by Americanized? Well, there are certain musical practices that African slaves brought with them to the United States when they were forced into slavery. A lot of these musical practices got Americanized because these slaves who had no exposure to Christianity before were now attracted to certain parts of the Bible, particularly the story of Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt. They're very interested in that. And so what they did is they combined African music and dance with stories from the Bible. Right? And this led to the creation of what we would call spirituals. Right? Spirituals are a genre of folk music, and they're kind of like gospel songs. Like if you were to go to a Southern Baptist church and you were to see a gospel choir singing, they sing a genre of music that is very similar to a spiritual. Right? So a spiritual is a gospel based or religious folk song. And what did they do in these songs? Well, they read themselves into the Bible, right? They combined aspects of their lives with events in the Bible. Because obviously, the story of Moses is going to be very attractive to a person who is enslaved, right? A lot of the Psalms that deal with um, crying out against injustice, right? Misery. These things are going to be attractive, um, especially to people who are experiencing similar or worse things in their own personal lives, like many of these slaves were. All right. So, yeah, life was really bad for the slaves. And of course, one of the things that happens when an entire group of people is being abused in this significant way is rebellion, resistance. So slaves did a lot of things to resist their enslavement, other than just trying to flat out escape, which happened quite often. Many slaves would deliberately sabotage their master, their owner's plantation, right? So they would work really slowly. They would pretend not to understand what they're supposed to do. They would break the equipment that they had. Like I said, a lot of slaves ran away. Now, if you ran away, um, you would have to go into hiding until you escaped into a region of the country, a state or territory that did not have slavery. Right? So they would flee to the north. Some even went as far north as Canada, where slavery was outlawed. And then, of course, there were violent rebellions as well, the most famous of which was Nat Turner's rebellion. So, Nat Turner was a slave who led a violent uprising against first his owner and his family, but then he went beyond that and he ended up killing 60 white people. Um, and many of these white people were murdered, right? Some of them were killed in their sleep, right? So Nat Turner didn't just kill his owner, he wanted to lead an uprising against pretty much all white people in the South, right? So he and the slaves, escaped slaves who joined his rebellion, many of them would sneak into houses of white people in the middle of the night and kill them. And all in all, about 60 white people were killed. And it's not just adults, right? A lot of children were killed by Nat Turner as well, right? So Nat Turner's rebellion led to the publication of a very famous book called The Confessions of Nat Turner, because Nat Turner was arrested and he was put on trial. And a journalist interviewed him and wrote this famous book called The Confessions of Nat Turner. And in that book, you can see Nat Turner is kind of a crazy guy, right? Obviously, he's very angry about the fact that he's enslaved, but he's got a few screws loose in his head as well. At least that is how this journalist is portraying him, right? Because one thing you have to keep in mind is in the South at this time, a lot of people uh, who are sympathetic to Nat Turner, not that they think that what he did was okay, but a lot of people who are sympathetic to Nat Turner um, still don't see him as equal to a white person, right? Um, in fact, a lot of abolitionists themselves, they didn't like slavery, so that's why they're abolitionists, but they wouldn't go so far as to say black people were equal to white people or should be treated the same under the law, right? And so the portrayal of Nat Turner in the Confessions of Nat Turner, um, the author does portray him as a crazy person, which might be true, but it might not be true, right? It might be the case that Nat Turner had very simple reasons for doing what he did, not that they're justified. Um, but if you read it, which you probably will in high school or college, um, it'll appear like he's just a crazy person. All right. So yes, Nat Turner was arrested and tried. Um, and in retaliation for the rebellion against Nat Turner, of course, Nat Turner was executed. All those who joined his rebellion were executed. But in addition to that, many innocent African American people were killed as well. Right. So it was kind of like a mini race war that broke out in the South. All right. So now we're on Westward Expansion. So this is the next section. So one of the things that started to happen in the South with the Cotton Kingdom and the tremendous wealth that some plantation owners were developing is the Southern population started to expand pretty significantly, and they needed new land in order to grow their farms, or in order for their children to have their own farms or their own plantations. So what ends up happening? Well, of course, Americans start to move west. And this westward expansion starts in the early 1800s, and it continues all the way until the 1900s. Right? So one of the early leaders of westward expansion was a guy named Daniel Boone. Right? He is a pioneer. It's a fancy word for an explorer. What Daniel Boone would do is he would travel through the Appalachian Mountains and west of the Appalachian Mountains, which in the beginning of the 1800s were not very populated at all. So this is like modern day Kentucky, Tennessee, parts of Missouri. So Daniel Boone travels through these areas and he clears roads. Now, why are roads important? Well, because if you're going to move out west, you got to bring all your stuff with you unless you want to start from scratch, start from poverty, right? So these people who want to move out west to start their own farms, they need to be able to bring wagons full of supplies and livestock through the Appalachian Mountains. And the only way to do that is if you have big roads that you can carry this stuff through. So traveling west is really difficult. Paths had to be turned into roads. And this led to two results. Number one, so many people moved out west that several states were added to the Union starting in the early 1800s. So remember, first we have just the 13 colonies plus Ohio and other states in the Northwest Territory. Well, the next states to be added to the Union are states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, a few others get added later on. These states are added because so many people move into these areas that they need representation in Congress. So in order to receive representation in Congress under the Constitution, you have to have statehood, right? That's the only way you can get a senator and Congress people to represent you. All right, so that's the first effect of westward expansion, many more states. Second effect of westward expansion are capitalist investments in roads, canals, and turnpikes, right? So the federal government and the state governments don't really have a lot of incentive to build roads. Building roads is a very labor-intensive, expensive process. So because the federal government and the state governments didn't really want to do this, capitalists stepped in, right? Remember, a capitalist is a person who invests a lot of money in expectation of a return, right? So they build factories, but they're also building roads, turnpikes, and canals, right? So they thought, okay, if we invest a bunch of money in building these roads, then we can make a lot of money because goods are going to be moving to and from our factories a lot